Intermezzo, counter-empire. Quote, while this heavenly city is on pilgrimage on earth, it calls out all peoples, and so collects a society of aliens, speaking all languages. End quote by St. Augustine. Quote, we want to destroy all the ridiculous monuments to those who have died for their fatherland, that stare down at us in every village, and in their place erect monuments to the deserters. The monuments to the deserters will represent also those who died in the war, because every one of them died cursing the war and envying the happiness of the deserter. Resistance is born of desertion. End quote from an anti-fascist partisan, Venice, 1943. We have now arrived at a turning point in our argument. The trajectory we have traced up until now, from our recognition of modernity as crisis to our analysis of the first articulations of a new imperial form of sovereignty, has allowed us to understand the transformations of the constitution of world order, but that order would be merely a hollow husk if we were not to designate also a new regime of production. Furthermore, we have not yet been able to give any coherent indication of what type of political subjectivities might contest and overthrow the forces of empire, because those subjectivities will arrive only on the terrain of production. It is as if, at this point, we can only see shadows of the figures that will animate our future. Let us therefore descend into the hidden abode of production to see the figures at work there. Even when we manage to touch on the productive ontological dimension of the problematic and the resistances that arise there, however, we will still not be in the position, not even at the end of this book, to point to any already existing and concrete elaboration of a political alternative to empire, and no such effective blueprint will ever arise from a theoretical articulation such as ours. It will arise only in practice. At a certain point in his thinking, Marx needed the Paris Commune in order to make the leap and conceive communism in concrete terms as an effective alternative to capitalist society. Some such experiment or series of experiments advanced to the genius of collective practice will certainly be necessary today to take the next concrete step and create a new social body beyond empire. One big union. Our studies set out from the hypothesis that the power of empire and the mechanisms of imperial sovereignty can be understood only when confronted on the most general scale, in their globality. We believe that toward the end of challenging and resisting empire in its world market, it is necessary to pose any alternative at an equally global level. Any proposition of a particular community in isolation, defined in racial, religious, or regional terms, delinked from empire, shielded from its powers by fixed boundaries, is destined to end up as a kind of ghetto. Empire cannot be resisted by a project aimed at a limited local autonomy. We cannot move back to any previous social form, nor move forward in isolation. Rather, we must push through empire to come out the other side. Deleuze and Guattari argued that rather than resist capital's globalization, we have to accelerate the process. But which, they ask, quote, is the revolutionary path? Is there one, to withdraw from the world market, or might it be to go in the opposite direction? To go still further, that is, in the movement of the market, of decoding and deterritorialization, end quote. Empire can be effectively contested only on its own level of generality, and by pushing the processes that it offers past their present limitations. We have to accept that challenge, and learn to think globally and act globally. Globalization must be met with a counter-globalization, empire with a counter-empire. In this regard, we might take inspiration from St. Augustine's vision of a project to contest the decadent Roman Empire. No limited community could succeed and provide an alternative to imperial rule. Only a universal Catholic community, bringing together all populations and all languages in a common journey, could accomplish this. The divine city is a universal city of aliens, coming together, cooperating, communicating. Our pilgrimage on earth, however, in contrast to St. Augustine's, has no transcendent telos beyond. It is, and remains, absolutely immanent. Its continuous movement, gathering aliens in community, making this world its home, is both means and end, or rather a means without end. From this perspective, the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, is the great Augustinian project of modern times. In the first decades of the 20th century, the Wobblies, as they were called, organized powerful strikes and rebellions across the United States, from Lawrence, Massachusetts, and Paterson, New Jersey, to Everett, Washington. The perpetual movement of the Wobblies was indeed an imminent pilgrimage, creating a new society in the shell of the old, without establishing fixed and stable structures of rule. In fact, the primary criticism of the IWW from the official left was, and continues to be, that its strikes, though powerful and often victorious, never left behind durable union structures. The Wobblies had extraordinary success among the vast and mobile immigrant populations, because they spoke all the languages of that hybrid labor force. The two accepted stories of the derivation of the name Wobbly illustrate these two central characteristics of the movement: its organizational mobility and its ethnic-linguistic hybridity. First, Wobbly is supposed to refer to the lack of a center, the flexible and unpredictable pilgrimage of IWW militancy. And second, the name is said to derive from the mispronunciation of a Chinese cook in Seattle, I wobbly wobbly. The primary focus of the IWW was the universality of its project. Workers of all languages and races across the world, although in fact they only made it so far as Mexico, and workers of all trades should come together in one big union. Taking our cue from the IWW, and clearly departing from Augustine in this regard, we would cast our political vision in line with the radical Republican tradition of modern democracy. What does it mean to be Republican today? What sense can it have in the postmodern era to take up that antagonistic position that constituted a radically democratic alternative within modernity? Where is the standpoint from which critique can be possible and effective? In this passage from modernity to postmodernity, is there still a place from which we can launch a critique and construct an alternative? Or, if we are consigned to the non-place of empire, can we construct a powerful non-place and realize it concretely as the terrain of a postmodern republicanism? The non-place of exploitation. In order to address this problematic, allow us a brief digression. We mentioned earlier that Marxist theoretical method, in line with the tradition of modern critiques of modernity, is situated in the dialectic between inside and outside. Proletarian struggles constitute, in real ontological terms, the motor of capitalist development. They constrain capital to adopt ever higher levels of technology, and thus transform labor processes. The struggles force capital continually to reform the relations of production and transform the relations of domination. From manufacturing to large-scale industry, from finance capital to transnational restructuring and the globalization of the market, it is always the initiatives of organized labor power that determine the figure of capitalist development. Through this history, the place of exploitation is a dialectically determined site. Labor power is the most internal element, the very source of capital. At the same time, however, labor power represents capital's outside. That is, the place where the proletariat recognizes its own use value, its own autonomy, and where it grounds its hopes for liberation. The refusal of exploitation, or really resistance, sabotage, insubordination, rebellion, and revolution, constitutes the motor force of the reality we live, and at the same time, is its living opposition. In Marxist thought, the relationship between the inside and the outside of capitalist development is completely determined in the dual standpoint of the proletariat, both inside and outside capital. This spatial configuration has led to many political positions founded on the dream of affirming the place of use value, pure and separate from exchange value and capitalist relations. In the contemporary world, this spatial configuration has changed. On the one hand, the relations of capitalist exploitation are expanding everywhere, not limited to the factory, but tending to occupy the entire social terrain. On the other hand, social relations completely invest the relations of production, making impossible any externality between social production and economic production. The dialectic between productive forces and the system of domination no longer has a determinate place. The very qualities of labor power, difference, measure, and determination can no longer be grasped, and similarly, exploitation can no longer be localized and quantified. In effect, the object of exploitation and domination tend not to be specific productive activities, but the universal capacity to produce. That is, abstract social activity, and its comprehensive power. This abstract labor is an activity without place, and yet it is very powerful. It is the cooperating set of brains and hands, minds and bodies. It is both the non-belonging and the creative social diffusion of living labor. It is a desire and the striving of the multitude of mobile and flexible workers. And at the same time, it is intellectual energy and linguistic and communicative construction of the multitude of intellectual and effective laborers. The inside defined by use value and the outside of exchange value are nowhere to be found, and hence any politics of use value, which was always based on an illusion of separability, is now definitively inconceivable. That does not mean, however, that production and exploitation have ceased. Neither have innovation and development nor the continuous restructuring of relations of power come to an end. On the contrary, today more than ever, as productive forces tend to be completely delocalized, completely universal, they produce not only commodities, but also rich and powerful social relationships. These new productive forces have no place, however, because they occupy all places, and they produce and are exploited in this indefinite non-place. The universality of human creativity, the synthesis of freedom, desire, and living labor is what takes place in the non-place of the postmodern relations of production. Empire is the non-place of world production where labor is exploited. By contrast, and with no possible homology with empire, here we find again the revolutionary formalism of modern republicanism. This is still a formalism because it is without place, but it is a potent formalism now that it is recognized, not as abstracted from the individual and collective subjects, but as a general power that constitutes their bodies and minds. The non-place as a brain, heart, torso, and limbs, globally. Being against nomadism, desertion, exodus. This recognition takes us back to the initial question, what does it mean to be Republican today? We have already seen that the modern critical response of opening the dialectic between inside and outside is no longer possible. An effective notion of postmodern republicanism would have to be constructed en milieu, on the basis of the lived experience of the global multitude. One element we can put our finger on at the most basic and elemental level is the will to be against. In general, the will to be against does not seem to require much explanation. Disobedience to authority is one of the most natural and healthy acts. To us, it seems completely obvious that those who are exploited will resist, and, given the necessary conditions, rebel. Today, however, this may not be so obvious. A long tradition of political scientists has said the problem is not why people rebel, but why they do not. Or rather, as Deleuze and Guattari say, quote, the fundamental problem of political philosophy is still precisely the one that Spinoza saw so clearly, and that Wilhelm Reich rediscovered. Why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it were their salvation? End quote. The first question of political philosophy today is not if or even why there will be resistance and rebellion, but rather how to determine the enemy against which to rebel. Indeed, often the inability to identify the enemy is what leads the will to resistance around in such paradoxical circles. The identification of the enemy, however, is no small task, given that exploitation tends no longer to have a specific place, and that we are immersed in a system of power so deep and complex that we can no longer determine specific difference or measure. We suffer exploitation, alienation, and command as enemies, but we do not know where to locate the production of oppression. And yet, we still resist and struggle. One should not exaggerate these logical paradoxes. Even though on the new terrain of empire, exploitation and domination often cannot be defined in specific places, they nonetheless exist. The globality of the command they impose represents the inverted image, something like a photonegative, of the generality of the multitude's productive activities. And yet, this inverted relation between imperial power and the power of the multitude does not indicate any homology. In effect, imperial power can no longer discipline the powers of the multitude. It can only impose control over their general social and productive capacities. From the economic point of view, the wage regime is replaced, as a function of regulation, by a flexible and global monetary system. Normative command is replaced by the procedures of control in the police. and the exercise of domination is formed through communicative networks. This is how exploitation and domination constitute a general non-place on the imperial terrain. Although exploitation and domination are still experienced concretely on the flesh of the multitude, they are nonetheless amorphous in such a way that it seems there is no place left to hide. If there is no longer a place that can be recognized as outside, we must be against in every place. This being against becomes the essential key to every active political position in the world, every desire that is effective, perhaps a democracy itself. The first anti-fascist partisans in Europe, armed deserters confronting their traitorous governments, were aptly called against men. Today, the generalized being against of the multitude must recognize imperial sovereignty as the enemy and discover the adequate means to subvert its power. Here we see once again the Republican principle in the very first instance: desertion, exodus, and nomadism. Whereas in the disciplinary era, sabotage was a fundamental notion of resistance, in the era of imperial control, it may be desertion. Whereas being against in modernity often meant a direct and/or dialectical opposition of forces, in post-modernity, being against might well be most effective in an oblique or diagonal stance. Battles against the empire might be won through subtraction and defection. This desertion does not have a place. It is the evacuation of the places of power. Throughout the history of modernity, the mobility and migration of the labor force have disrupted the disciplinary conditions to which workers are constrained, and power has wielded the most extreme violence against this mobility. In this respect, slavery can be considered as a continuum with the various wage labor regimes as the most extreme repressive apparatus to block the mobility of the labor force. The history of black slavery in the Americas demonstrates both the vital need to control the mobility of labor and the irrepressible desire to flee on the part of the slaves. From the closed ships of the Middle Passage to the elaborate repressive techniques employed against escaped slaves, mobility and mass worker nomadism always express a refusal and a search for liberation, the resistance against the horrible conditions of exploitation and the search for freedom and new conditions of life. It will be interesting, in fact, to write a general history of the modes of production from the standpoint of the workers' desire for mobility, from the country to the city, from the city to the metropolis, from one state to another, from one continent to another, rather than running through that development simply from the standpoint of capital's regulation of the technological conditions of labor. This history would substantially reconfigure the Marxian conception of the stages of the organization of labor, which has served as a theoretical framework for numerous authors up to Polanyi. Today, the mobility of labor power in migratory movements is extraordinarily diffuse and difficult to grasp. Even the most significant population movements of modernity, including the black and white Atlantic migrations, constitute Lilliputian events with respect to the enormous population transfers of our time. A specter haunts the world, and it is the specter of migration. All the powers of the old world are allied in a merciless operation against it, but the movement is irresistible. Along with the flight from the so-called Third World, there are flows of political refugees and transfers of intellectual labor power, in addition to the massive movements of the agricultural, manufacturing, and service proletariat. The legal and documented movements are dwarfed by clandestine migrations. The borders of national sovereignty are sieves, and every attempt at complete regulation runs up against violent pressure. Economists attempt to explain this phenomenon by presenting their equations and models, which, even if they were complete, would not explain the irrepressible desire for free movement. In effect, what pushes from behind is, negatively, desertion from the miserable cultural and material conditions of imperial reproduction. But positively, what pulls forward is the wealth of desire and the accumulation of expressive and productive capacities that the process of globalization had determined in the consciousness of every individual and social group, and thus a certain hope. Desertion and exodus are a powerful form of class struggle within and against imperial post-modernity. This mobility, however, still constitutes a spontaneous level of struggle, and as we noted earlier, it most often leads today to a new rootless condition of poverty and misery. A new nomad horde, a new race of barbarians, will arise to invade or evacuate empire. Nietzsche was oddly prescient of their destiny in the 19th century. Quote, "Problem, where are the barbarians of the 20th century? Obviously, they will come into view and consolidate themselves only after tremendous socialist crises. End quote. We cannot say exactly what Nietzsche foresaw in his lucid delirium. But indeed, what recent event could be a stronger example of the power of desertion and exodus, the power of the nomad horde, than the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the entire Soviet bloc? In the desertion from socialist discipline, savage mobility and mass migration contributed substantially to the collapse of the system. In fact, the desertion of productive cadres disorganized and struck at the heart of the disciplinary system of the bureaucratic Soviet world. The mass exodus of highly trained workers from Eastern Europe played a central role in provoking the collapse of the wall. Even though it refers to the particularities of the social state system, this example demonstrates that the mobility of the labor force can indeed express an open political conflict and contribute to the destruction of the regime. What we need, however, is more. We need a force capable of not only organizing the destructive capacities of the multitude, but also constituting through the desires of the multitude an alternative. The counter-empire must also be a new global vision, a new way of living in the world. Numerous Republican political projects in modernity assume mobility as a privileged terrain for struggle and organization. From the so-called Socians of the Renaissance, Tuscan and Lombard artisans and apostles of the Reform who, banished from their own country, fomented sedition against the Catholic nations of Europe, from Italy to Poland, up to the 17th century sects that organized transatlantic voyages in response to the massacres in Europe, and from the agitators of the IWW across the United States in the 1910s, up to the European autonomists in the 1970s. In these modern examples, mobility became an act of politics and established a political position. This mobility of the labor force and this political exodus have 1,000 threads that are interwoven. Old traditions and new needs are mixed together, just as the republicanism of modernity and modern class struggle were woven together. Postmodern republicanism, if it is to rise, must face a similar task. New barbarians. Those who are against, while escaping from the local and particular constraints of their human condition, must also continually attempt to construct a new body and a new life. This is a necessarily violent, barbaric passage, but as Walter Benjamin says, it is a positive barbarism. Quote, barbarisms, precisely. We affirm this in order to introduce a new, positive notion of barbarism. What does the poverty of experience oblige a barbarian to do? To begin anew, to begin from the new. The new barbarian sees nothing permanent, but for this very reason he sees ways everywhere. Where others encounter walls or mountains, there too he sees a way. But because he sees a way everywhere, he has to clear things from it everywhere. Because he sees ways everywhere, he always positions himself at crossroads. No moment can know what the next will bring. What exists he reduces to rubble, not for the sake of the rubble, but for that of the way leading through it. End quote. The new barbarians destroy with an affirmative violence and trace new paths of life through their own material existence. These barbaric deployments work on human relations in general, but we can recognize them today first and foremost in corporeal relations and configurations of gender and sexuality. Conventional norms of corporeal and sexual relations between and within genders are increasingly open to challenge and transformation. Bodies themselves transform and mutate to create new post-human bodies. The first condition of this corporeal transformation is the recognition that human nature is in no way separate from nature as a whole, that there are no fixed and necessary boundaries between the human and the animal, the human and the machine, the male and the female, and so forth. It is a recognition that nature itself is an artificial terrain, open to ever new mutations, mixtures, and hybridizations. Not only do we consciously subvert the traditional boundaries, dressing and drag for example, but we also move in a creative, indeterminate zone au milieu, in between and without regard for those boundaries. Today's corporeal mutations constitute an anthropological exodus and represent an extraordinary important, but still quite ambiguous, element of the configuration of republicanism against imperial civilization. The anthropological exodus is important primarily because here is where the positive, constructive phase of the mutation begins to appear, an ontological mutation in action, the concrete invention of a first, new place in the non-place. This creative evolution does not merely occupy any existing place, but rather invents a new place. It is a desire that creates a new body, a metamorphosis that breaks all the naturalistic homologies of modernity. The notion of anthropological exodus is still very ambiguous. However, because its methods, hybridization and mutation, are themselves the very methods employed by imperial sovereignty. In the dark world of cyberpunk fiction, for example, the freedom of self-fashioning is often indistinguishable from the powers of an all-encompassing control. We certainly do need to change our bodies and ourselves, and in perhaps a much more radical way than the cyberpunk authors imagine. In our contemporary world, the now common aesthetic mutations of the body, such as piercings and tattoos, punk fashion and its various imitations, are all initial indications of this corporeal transformation. But in the end, they do not hold a candle to the kind of radical mutation needed here. The will to be against really needs a body that is completely incapable of submitting to command. It needs a body that is incapable of adapting to family life, to factory discipline, to the regulations of a traditional sex life, and so forth. If you find your body refusing these normal modes of life, don't despair. Realize your gift. In addition to being radically unprepared for normalization, however, the new body must also be able to create a new life. We must go much further to define that new place in the non-place, well beyond the simple experiences of mixture and hybridization, and the experiments that are conducted around them. We have to arrive at constituting a coherent political artifice, an artificial becoming in the sense that the humanists spoke of a homo, produced by art and knowledge, and that Spinoza spoke of a powerful body produced by that highest consciousness that is infused with love. The infinite paths of the barbarians must form a new mode of life. Such transformations will always remain weak and ambiguous, however, so long as they are cast only in terms of form and order. Hybridity itself is an empty gesture, and the mere refusal of order simply leaves us on the edge of nothingness. Or worse, these gestures risk reinforcing imperial power rather than challenging it. The new politics is given real substance only when we shift our focus from the question of form and order to the regimes and practices of production. On the terrain of production, we will be able to recognize that this mobility and artificiality do not merely represent the exceptional experiences of small privileged groups, but indicate rather the common productive experience of the multitude. As early as the 19th century, proletarians were recognized as the nomads of the capitalist world, even when their lives remain fixed in one geographical location. As is most often the case, their creativity and productivity define corporeal and ontological migrations. The anthropological metamorphoses of bodies are established through the common experience of labor and the new technologies that have constitutive effects and ontological implications. Tools have always functioned as human prostheses, integrated into our bodies through our laboring practices is a kind of anthropological mutation, both in individual terms and in terms of collective social life. The contemporary form of exodus and the new barbarian life demand that tools become poetic prostheses, liberating us from the conditions of modern humanity. To go back to the Marxian digression we made earlier, when the dialectic between inside and outside comes to an end, and when the separate place of used value disappears from the imperial terrain, the new forms of labor power are charged with the task of producing anew the human, or really the post-human. This task will be accomplished primarily through the new and increasingly immaterial forms of effective and intellectual labor power, in the community that they constitute, and the artificiality that they present as a project. With this passage, the deconstructive phase of critical thought, which from Heidegger and Adorno to Derrida provided a powerful instrument for the exit from modernity, has lost its effectiveness. It is now a closed parenthesis and leaves us faced with a new task: constructing in the non-place a new place, constructing ontologically new determinations of the human, of living, a powerful artificiality of being. Donna Haraway's cyborg fable, which resides at the ambiguous boundary between human, animal, and machine, introduces us today, much more effectively than deconstruction, to these new terrains of possibility. But we should remember that this is a fable and nothing more. The force that must instead drive forward theoretical practice to actualize these terrains of potential metamorphosis is still, and ever more intensely, the common experience of the new productive practices, and the concentration of productive labor on the plastic and fluid terrain of the new communicative, biological, and mechanical technologies. Being Republican today, then, means first of all struggling within and constructing against empire on its hybrid, modulating terrains. And here we should add, against all moralisms and all positions of resentment and nostalgia, that this new imperial terrain provides greater possibilities for creation and liberation. The multitude, in its will to be against, and its desire for liberation, must push through empire to come out the other side.